Chapter 8. It was time for some inventory taking. With the fate of the galaxy on the line, and with Alice seriously injured, maybe dying on board our ship, I was now separated from my friends, who were dealing with my greatest enemy's most loyal and vengeful servant. Back on Earth, my parents were in the hands of invaders who hated me, led by a woman who would not hesitate to hurt them if she thought it would bring her some advantage. Meanwhile, I was plunging towards a planet so worthless that even the Fads hadn't bothered to conquer it. I was alone, with limited supplies, food and drink designated for aliens whose nutritional needs might not be compatible with mine, and heading into dangers for which I was totally unprepared. These were all bad, but they weren't the worst thing. Tamret had said she needed help, and I couldn't do anything for her. I'd promised I would always be there, and now, because I was the genius who thought it was a great idea to hide in an escape pod, I could not help her. This was one of those disasters that everyone always felt sure was my fault. In the past, those had always been decisions I'd made. In tight spots, I'd chosen to act, and I felt like almost every time those actions had been right. But they'd also had unintended consequences that made beings across vast expanses of space hate my guts. This time, it was much worse. Those other mistakes I could look back on and tell myself that I had done the right thing. This time, I had somehow accidentally launched an escape pod, separating myself from the others. I didn't know where they were heading, and it was entirely possible that they hadn't yet figured out I was on the escape pod. In the meantime, they were heading off to some unknown location. But I had to think Ardov was sending them back to Junip, or even directly into Phatic hands. Although I knew virtually nothing about it, I thought of Planet Pleasant and shuddered. What could they do to protect themselves? There was no way that they could change their destination once in tunnel. The most they could do would be to gain control of the ship and drop out of tunnel entirely. Assuming they were awake and could overpower Ardov, that is. Otherwise, they would be facing a whole lot of Phatic forces when they got to where they were going. What if they did get away? With time running short, they were hardly going to take a detour to rescue me. They were going to have to figure out what happened to Captain Quassel, or go after Glee-Wixix and the others directly. Those were the only logical choices, and that meant that the best-case scenario was that I would be completely sidelined until Junip was either out of power, or my friends failed. Now, I realized gloomily, it was time to think about the worst-case scenario. I was heading towards an uninhabited planet full of unknown dangers, with limited, possibly inadequate resources. While my former upgrades had been working, I'd been playing in creative mode, but now the settings had been switched to survival. I had to shut down the part of my brain that was worried about my friends. I needed to figure out what sort of supplies I had, what sort of dangers I might face, and how I could stay alive. Maybe no one lived down there anymore, but it was the site of a secret dig for former artifacts, which meant there might be stuff on the planet for me to use. That sounded promising until I remembered I was talking about finding things on a planet. It wasn't that long ago that I'd had a hard time finding overdue library books in my own bedroom. I wasn't Luke Skywalker. I couldn't count on crashing my ship within strolling distance of Yoda's hut. It was time to try and figure out the Phatic computers. The only other times I'd tried to make sense of their system, I'd been desperately searching for just the right thing with no time to spare. Now, at least, I was under a little less pressure. I checked the pod's inventory of supplies, and found there were enough food and moisture packs to last 8 beings 8 days. I did a quick analysis of the contents of the pack, and found they were biologically compatible with my physiology. I had hoped to go my whole life without having to taste Phatic food, but I didn't think it would be good. Because I didn't think it would be good, but At least it would be edible, which was definitely a plus. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten, and only adrenaline and terror were keeping my hunger from distracting me. I grabbed one of the food packs, but I couldn't bring myself to eat yet. I needed to get a better sense of what I was dealing with. I had a weapon, and I wasn't going to die of hunger or thirst in the next few days, so that sort of counted as good news. The next issue was figuring out what I'd be dealing with on this planet itself, and things there were less cheery. The pod's database had no detailed information about the world I was about to call home for an indefinite amount of time. It only listed it as uninhabited and undesirable. I was going to a place the fads found undesirable, and that did not fill me with hope. On the other hand, I was sure they'd find a candy store undesirable, so maybe the planet would be a wonderland of chocolate. The pod rumbled as it entered atmosphere, and then I felt the automatic altitude control kick in. I was then able to activate both a topographical map, which would be useful for helping me find the most ideal landing site, and a view screen that provided images of the surface. The chocolate wonderland theory was not holding up. I saw mostly desert and vast oceans whose water, the computer told me, was undrinkable. I surveyed the planet for possible landing sites, but I lacked a clear sense of what I was looking for. There wasn't a whole lot of variety in the terrain. Sun-blasted valleys, rocky outcroppings, waterless mountains. I then scanned for Confederation technology. Whatever Captain Quassel and her team had been doing here, they must have left some of their equipment behind. Their camp might contain useful supplies. There might even be some Confederation comm beacons I could use to let them know what had happened to me. I doubted if those things could get me off-world in time to help the others, but at least they would know that they needed to save me after they were done saving civilization. I picked up what might have been residual signs of Confederation technology. They were faint and indistinct, certainly not something that would scream out to a passing fad vessel, but I was running a thorough search for something I thought might be hidden away. I scanned the surrounding area, and the ship's database told me that there was a suspected former historical site nearby. There were no guarantees, but I figured I had a pretty good idea of where the dig might have been. I next selected a reasonable place to land within hiking distance. I found a place with a high density of vegetation, which was of the tough desert variety, but it was better than nothing. Also, the area seemed especially light on the carnivorous plants that appeared to be the planet's dominant life form. There was no avoiding the fact that I was headed into the desert. Not like Sahara sand dunes, but more like the expansive scrubland that I'd passed through when traveling across New Mexico. Rolling hills of dirt and sand, hardy and likely inedible plants, little water, and few animals. However, my scans detected the presence of underground springs, and I downloaded the information to my bracelet. There were a few places where a strategic blast or two with my PPB pistol would get me plenty to drink. I was feeling marginally less miserable, but the move from total to mild desperation didn't bring me a lot of comfort. I was still alone, isolated, worried about the others, and hoping against hope I would find... what? Another operational spaceport like the one at the Hidden Fortress? There had been one, I suppose, so there was no reason to believe there could not be another. On the other hand, if there had been that much technology lying around, the fads would not have ignored the planet, which was on the border of their territory. I had no idea what Captain Quassel had been doing here, but it must have been important for her to let it occupy her time in this period of crisis. It seemed like a safe bet that she hadn't been looking for emergency transport. Maybe she'd found something. Maybe what she'd learned would lead her to a place where she and her crew would discover technology that would utterly crush the fads, or Junip. Technology like we had discovered and destroyed at the Hidden Fortress. It would be nice, but none of that felt exciting to me. I wanted to bring Junip down. Now. I didn't want to spend my time digging through the dust of a forgotten planet while the real battle was being waged elsewhere, while my friends were in danger. Frustration seethed inside me, ready to explode, but I had to keep calm. I couldn't let my feelings take control. If I let the cork out of that bottle, I'd never be able to survive. I tried to clear my mind, to calm my breathing, while the autopilot worked its way through the planet's atmosphere. I opened the cap of the food packet, which was a long tube made of some synthetic material similar to plastic. I braced myself for the worst. The package boasted it was made of 100% genuine carapace, and squeezed the contents into my mouth. It wasn't terrible. It tasted like a bland version of peanut butter, though I was getting slight notes of beetle. There were only a few spoonfuls in the pack, but I guessed it was nutrient-dense, since my hunger more or less vanished after the first taste, leaving me free to concentrate on all the ways my life was now a complete disaster. Finally, I thudded to a soft landing on the planet's soil. I sat very still for a moment, looking at the flashing lights of the readout, trying to clear my mind. I didn't want to think about how this was the worst situation I'd ever been in. I had never been so helpless and so alone. I didn't want to listen to the voice inside my head telling me I was going to be lost forever. I didn't want to give in to the fear and the anger and the misery. I silently chanted that I was going to get through this. I clenched my teeth and took a deep breath, and then got to work. First, I performed a series of environmental scans to make sure the air was safe. There was no dangerous radiation, and no Zeke-devouring plants. As near as I could tell, I wouldn't run into anything but small creatures once I stepped outside, nothing larger than a rabbit. Many of these animals were poisonous, but if I didn't step on, kick, or otherwise antagonize them, the data suggested they were likely to leave me alone. The hopelessness of my situation washed over me again, but I pushed it back. Feeling sorry for myself, or worrying about Temred and the others, was not going to help me survive. And it was not going to help me find a way to get back in the game. If there was a way to do that, it was outside this pod, and so saying, I opened the doors and prepared to go out and find it. I felt the rush of warm, fresh air, the sharp scent of herbs, utterly unfamiliar but somehow not unlike things I'd smelled before. Light, impossibly bright, streamed into the pod, and I had to squint and turn away. I already felt thirsty, so I grabbed a couple of moisture packs and stepped out of the door. Sand, rocks, weeds. Repeat in one direction towards Rocky Hill, and in the other towards Rocky Valley. The heat felt like it was weighing down on me, like it was penetrating all the way to my bones. The sun itself loomed bright and orange and unrelenting in the sky. It somehow gave the impression of being twice the size of Earth's. Gravity was about normal, typical for a former world, but otherwise, everything about this place was miserable. It felt used and dried up, like I was visiting it a few billion years after its prime. I was about to begin a preliminary exploration of my landing site when I heard it. The slight mechanical whir and click of a compartment opening. It was coming from inside the pod itself. I spun, hardly knowing what to expect, but ready for anything. I raised my pistol as my heart pounded in my chest. Without my upgrades, combat was completely terrifying. One of the emergency medical bays was sliding open with excruciating slowness. Someone, or something, had been in the pod with me. Had there been fads on board the ship the whole time? Had whoever was in the medical compartment helped Ardov get free? I backed up, ready to make my escape if I needed to. I tried to steady my arm and make myself ready to fire. The door continued to creep open, lifting inch by painful inch. Then, I saw a familiar, tall form. His goofy face grinning with bewilderment and good cheer. Volonic poked his head out. "Is it safe for me to emerge?" I'd thought there was nothing worse than being utterly alone on a dead world. But now it seemed I had discovered that I was wrong.